Our guest speaker today is Elisa Loberg, who's been working for Oregon DOT for more than 10 years doing roadway design down in Region 2. She's going to give us a presentation on what goes through a designer's mind when they are trying to set up a project. Elisa, are you ready?
I am. Thank you. Welcome all. Lenny asked me to present a project I just completed an ORD, and hopefully it will help others in some file management. This is the first, it's a big project. So it's a 3R urban job that in the city of Garibaldi. There we go. Okay. So just a little bit of the project info. It was on Highway 101. It's an urban section. It's 12 blocks downtown Garibaldi with correction of cross slope and profile changes, ADA ramp upgrades, sidewalk replacements, and 2 rail crossing improvements, along with the associated drainage requirements or drainage upgrades. And so here's just a quick example of the project in an aerial that I was set up with. And so when ORD came out for ODOT, I looked at this project and said, how am I going to design in ORD? Because ORD is different than inroads, and it's treated a little different. And so throughout the process, I made notes, and I'm hoping this will help explain kind of the setup. So hopefully this will help folks when they have urban jobs on how to set files up and what is needed from start to finish. So with the project, I kind of identified a workflow or work path for files and how they're used in ORD. And so we've got our geometry files, we've got our corridor files, terrain files, and cross sections. Those are all connected. We often reference each of them into each other. And so with ORD, I tried the typical inroads style of modeling it all in one corridor and learned lessons from doing that. So I ended up having to break it apart. There's also additional files, annotation files, long cut profiles, working files. There's a super file that comes in, and then your XMLs that you hand off to eBids and construction. And they are all really connected. So from the start, you kind of have to look at the project and say, how am I going to break this apart? Trying to put everything in one file might be painful later on. And so I chose not to do that. So the first file that I will end up going over is going to be the geometry file. So if we look at the project itself, I'll go into each of these files. So the geometry file, what is a geometry file for this project for me? I had main alignments, I had secondary alignments, I had main linear geometry, and then I had intersection corners or ADA ramp geometry. And so I've broken them out here on the screen. Because of the new program and my unknown user ability, I ended up breaking the main alignment into 3 different sections. It's the dark blue, orange, and light blue for your normal lane lines, sidewalk, curb lines, edge of pavement, lane lines. The alignment itself got its own separate file. So the reason for this is when I was dealing with these files, I would often get crashes. I'd try something and the file would crash. So I'd have to either recreate it, and this was 2 years ago. So this project is now just finishing. But in order to save my sanity, I learned how to break it apart. And so I broke out the curb ramps into their own files. I broke out the alignments into their own files. And this helped me safeguard the data. So if I worked on one file and it was done, it was done. And then when I moved on to the next side street, that work would contain, and it wouldn't affect the previous work. And so I think I had probably about 20 geometry files. They were referenced into each other. They were ruled off of each other. And it turned out actually pretty well. It is a lot of files to open. I acknowledge that. That is the downside. But they could all be grabbed into a geometry base container file to be displayed in an OPNP file, to be displayed to other designers. Relatively easy, and that worked out really well. So this was the setup I used for geometry files. Once I had the geometry kind of figured out, I switched over to the corridor files. You would think that a corridor file would match a geometry file, but that wasn't entirely the case. So in terms of Garibaldi, I originally tried modeling it, the backbone with sidewalks on each side, dropping templates as I needed them. And this turned out to be a bigger processing issue for my machine and the program than I was willing to deal with. So I ended up breaking out the corridors into two scenarios. I had basically the asphalt, so the main line backbone would go through the whole project, and in this case it was the L line, went from start to finish, and I threw template drops for just those asphalt conditions, whether I had grind and inlay, I had AMG grinding, or full depth reconstruction. And once that was done, then I went back and I attached sidewalk corridors or in condition corridors. So in between each block, as you see in the picture here, I've color coded each corridor. So each color is a different corridor in a different file. And what that allowed me to do is to only have template drops for, say, the in conditions in this green section here, or in this blue section, I had a couple driveways. They didn't affect the corridors preceding it or coming after it. So that once this block was done, and I've ruled the corridor off the feature line from the backbone corridor, and it was finished and it would come through correctly, and I didn't have the instability issue or the corruption problems I did when I tried to model the entire corridor at once. It cut down my cross section or my template drops. I only had to focus on template drops in this section. It cut down on the point controls I had to use. I didn't have to go into the table and manage point controls or parametrics or key stations. And so it cleaned up the amount of processing my computer did and became a much more stable corridor. And so that's how I laid out these corridors. Now, when it came to the side streets, you'll see two aqua colored, I guess, or weird green color. Those ones I was actually able to model in a full backbone and in condition scenario because they were smaller. The template drops were minimal. I maybe only had 10 or 15. I didn't have 30 or 40. They were pretty simple, separated sidewalks with maybe one or two driveways. And so these were able to be modeled in one continuous corridor. Driveways, I did have driveways separate if they had their own alignments. Those were in their own corridors. Again, with the corridor pub files, I would place them all in a container file that then could be referenced by other designers or other users of plans, profiles, etc.
Now, before you go on,
Yeah.
I have a question for you.
Sure.
Or maybe it's just a point. You said that you created this red corridor, your mainline corridor. That's the backbone. That's the major thing. You
Right.
have to do that first in order to establish all of those longitudinal grade lines that all of the other corridors use for their control.
Correct. Yes, that is true. Because the backbone corridor had an edge of pavement point feature line that I would then model the side gutter edge of apron line off of. Now they
Okay.
still use the L line, the main alignment, to model off of. They were just point controlled to those edge of pavement lines. So they still ran on the same station crosses, the same processing. They would still have template drops in the same location
Right.
because
You
they were
didn't need a
run
separate alignment for them.
alignment.
You
No,
just used the edge of pavement as a point control. They ran along the same L line. Now,
correct.
if you made changes to your backbone
Mm-hmm.
that affected either the XY location of that edge of pavement or the elevation, all you'd have to do, am I correct, is to reopen
Correct.
let's say that driveway corridor in cyan
Mm-hmm.
blue. After you'd
Mm-hmm.
made the mainline changes, then you just reopen that corridor and it processes. Cool.
Correct.
Okay.
Yes. So you do have to pay attention to where the changes in the main backbone were, but once it actually worked out really well, because once the saw cuts and full depth versus grind and inlay, once it was decided, because those template drops never lined up with a driveway or a ramp or a wall, something to that effect. Once they were done, I didn't actually have to open that file hardly at all. And so it was just these little, what I called spot or block corridors. So it was much easier with the table. I wasn't fighting that table that gets really long because it's just very specific to this. Now, the one advice I do have is when you name your corridors in each of those files, don't call them L corridor in every file. Actually give them a better name. So the main line can be called L, but each one of these should be like L 3rd Street or L 4th Street, something to break them apart, because when you go to reference that corridor in something else, they all come in as L and you can't tell them apart.
So the issue that you're getting is that if they were in the same file, the corridors would require unique names.
Correct.
But because they're in separate files, you could be lazy with your naming. But if they're all called L corridor, you couldn't tell the difference between them if you were just looking at a list of corridors. Yeah.
Correct.
Good idea.
Yeah. And that comes into point later when you do like point controls, because you're looking for an EP feature line. Well, there's 3 EP feature lines of an L corridor, but it doesn't give you the file name when it displays them. So it just gives you a list of however many L lines. So I started using
to unique naming that is descriptive for you as you go along.
Come up with kind of a name. That's right.
And this is the internal name. This isn't even the file name. This is the internal name.
Internal corridor name. Yes. And that'll help later on too when you create terrains, because you have the same issue with the terrains. Anything internal.
Right. Quick question for you.
Sure.
Since our naming and project-wise, we're kind of limited with the name, did you take that internal name for the corridor, for example, and put that into the description so that it was really easy to tell which file contained which corridor? Okay.
Yes, the description became super important. You could do an L1, L2, L3, right? You could sequentially number them. That's great, but you have to keep track of what the sequential numbers are. I ended up putting a left and a right for the sidewalk. So I did L left, L right, O1, O2. That at least got me.
And then maybe the street that it started on.
Could potentially the street, yeah. So if it's between blocks, I do like 3rd and 4th or 3rd_4th, 3_4, something to tell me that's where that block was. And this is kind of the same for the geometry files. Naming is super important. Also filling out the logical and the description in the file for that model. If you fill it out ahead of time as you're referencing in lots of files, that'll auto-populate and you don't have to figure it out later. So that that's
And
just
I would ask you to
Mhm.
demonstrate that, but she's talking about the model
properties.
for
Yeah.
properties. There is a model property when you've got your models dialog open that allows you to have a reference logical. It's really a seed for the reference logical. And yeah, that's a great way to do it, because then when you are adding these things as references, you have a clue of where they are geographically. Yeah, brilliant.
That corresponds to pretty much every one of these files in terms of the terrain, cross sections, annotation files, all of them. If you pre-fill those out, you don't have to try to figure them out later. What's 03? I have no idea what's 03.
Yeah, I'll find a picture
So,
of that dialog box and paste it into the chat.
thank you. Oh, good questions. Thank you, Lenny. So that's how I treated the main corridor. Now, when it came to intersections, obviously, I broke them apart with the side street corridor, and then I had a curb ramp corridor. So I ran a curb around the corner, and matched the pavement in so that these all basically tied in, and they each got their own file. Curb return files for corridor files, I did choose to put for this project, I put 2 curb returns in each file. That seemed to process okay. My opinion is I wouldn't go over 4. Again, it goes back to, if the file goes bad, how much do you want to recover? So my rule of thumb on this was 3 to 5 days. If I could rebuild it in 3 days, 3 to 5 days, that's the size of the file I wanted.
So with the way you put your
Mhm.
corridors in, typically in a separate file for each, I think what I heard you say is that when it came to the curb ramp corridors, like that center alignment that's orange, has that funny color green on both sides,
That's
that
right.
would be 2 corridors that share the same corridor file.
Correct.
Right. Okay.
Correct.
Yeah.
And they're far enough apart they didn't clash with each other too much. That's the other, you can put multiple corridors in one file, but it becomes hard seeing the template drops or the point controls if they're all ruled off the same alignment, because they overlap and the level separation isn't there for multiple corridors in one file. So you can put them if they're, in this case, there's the center corridor that would have been a separate file, right? So these 2 won't clash, but if it was the sidewalk next to this curb return, you will get a crossing of the manipulators that is hard to manage. So it's easier to keep them in a separate file. Hope that made sense.
It
Okay.
does. Thank you.
Okay. So for that's kind of what I had for the corridor layout. You really want to look at what's happening in the files and kind of come up with a plan. It's to try to split them up later is really hard. So laying this out and looking at it ahead of time is super beneficial. Okay, and then so once you have your corridors set up, or in the process of design, I should say, the next one I was going to discuss is the drainage and utility file. I treated it just like kind of my corridor files. I looked at a separation plan. I didn't want everything in one file because I didn't want to lose it. I drew horizontal and vertical geometry and ran a template along each of the pipes. So for this project, I had 6 different systems. One of the systems is off to the right. You can't see it. So that's why it only looks like 5. It's off over here. But I created an individual file for each system. And then with that, I could display them. This is the drainage design. 2 things, I could project those pipes into the profile to get the profiles set up for plans, or I could display them, attach them to the cross-section file, and they display in the cross-sections. As you cut your cross-section, the pipe will come in and out. So it helped visually me verify that my pipes were draining in the right direction, because I had 6 different systems. They all drained differently, so they all had a different outfall. I made them 6 different files. And then also the annotation for them would be in separate files, which I'll get to in the next slide. That this helped break apart, again, if I lost it, it wasn't 3 months worth of work I was losing. So then we get to the annotation files, and I learned some good and some bad things with the annotation files. The first thing I learned is that all the annotation I dealt with was best handled in a drawing model, not in the design models. I had centerline crashes, I had alignment crashes when the alignment was displayed with the actual civil lines. And I think from my understanding is it would try to process it. If you have it displayed and you go to move something, it tries to do too much processing, and I would get crashes. So I separated out my annotation into I have 6 or 7 different types. So I had mainline alignment annotation went into one file. Secondary alignment annotation went into individually separate files. So street, first street, second street, third street all got their own files. And the reason for this is when you open an annotation file with ORD, the program reprocesses the data, that it re-verifies that the data it's displaying is correct, regardless of whether you've done anything to the main geometry file, so your main alignment file. It will reprocess. So if you've made edits, cleaned it up for the plans, they will revert back to the original default conditions. So to stop this, if you put them in separate files, once you've displayed them and you know that alignment is done, and in this case it would be the blue cyan here in this file, it's a separate file from the other annotation. It never, I displayed it once and moved on. It got edited, and then I didn't have to worry about it reprocessing if I had an edit to the annotation for the ADA ramps. So those got their own file. The curb returns alignment data, which is the green in the picture, got its own file. And it's truly to separate that data so that it doesn't reprocess. That was a painful learning experience.
Can I make a comment here
yes.
too? Just like with the corridors that were hung on the left and right edges of your main line, for your end conditions, how you had to remember to open those files if you made changes to your main line. Same thing, I suppose it'd be true here. This would be like on a checklist for things to make sure were updated before you were done, is to open each one of those annotation files and let it reprocess so that you were sure. Okay, yeah.
Absolutely.
Nice little checklist to make. Okay.
But it was also nice on the other side too, is that if I was working on the other end of the project, because I had 12 blocks or 13 intersections, that I was on 11th Street and this is 3rd Street, I knew 3rd Street didn't need to be opened. So it was nice when they were broken apart that I was comfortable that the data did not change because they were in separate files.
Right. Yeah, and you were doing it as you went along. Yeah.
So that was a nice check. So again, the number one thing is that drawing models for annotation files, and then an annotation container file became super handy because the drafters could reference that in, and then all of your annotation is in one spot for them to find and use as appropriate, instead of trying to reference individual annotation pub files. That helped a lot, and they can turn them on and off. This helps separate the data. So if the curb ramp data wasn't needed, it was a separate detail for a driveway or something, you can turn on and off the data easier than having it all in one file. Okay.
And then that reference logical name is again a really great thing to put on there. But the drawing model is a different model than the design type model. So make sure that you put the reference logical on the model that you're going to have people attaching as references.
Correct.
Yeah.
Correct. And I left drawing in the name of the model just so I knew it was a drawing model versus a design model.
That's nice.
That's just my not tracking 100 files ease. The other thing with intersections, again, 2 curb ramps per file is typically was my safe area. On some of them I could get 4, but I noticed that the processing of those annotations, if I had to go back in and make edits or adjust them, got pretty long. It could be 2 minutes of processing, of sitting and waiting for the program to process. Also opening, the other consideration is anytime you reference geometry files, corridor files, the more you reference that you don't use, the more the program will delay opening or delay processing. So only reference the files you need for the location of that file. So don't reference all of your geometry files for this project, just reference the ones you need to annotate. And it will reduce the time the annotation file processes. So I would not recommend using a container file in an annotation file. But that's what I've learned on my project. I'm not saying that's the ultimate way to do it, but that's something I learned from timing.
So the container file is a good way to deliver that annotation to the plans production process or to other disciplines,
Correct.
but not a great way for you to work with your files. You would reference the actual pub files. Okay.
Yeah, because referencing into the plans, it's not processing the data, right? So it's just referencing kind of pseudo dumb data. It's just a reference at that time. When you open a file, it has to reference all of your geometry or container or corridor files and then check them, right? Because you're opening with ORD. If you were to open with MicroStation, it'd probably be really fast, but because it's processing, you only want the files it needs to look at. Other files just take a lot of time to download and aren't necessary. Because the other thing with the annotation file is when it's referenced into the plans or the drafter, they're not live nesting all of the design files behind it, so that makes it easier to see. They're just looking for the text.
Thanks. That makes sense.
Yeah. Thank you. Okay. So in line with the annotation, the other files that were created for this project were the profile long cuts, which is a drawing type model that you use to display your design profile, and the annotation needed to display in plans. They originally tried putting them all in one file. Again, like everything else, it was too much for that file, took a long time to process, or it would one profile would crash. I'd have to delete it and redisplay it, and that would cause problems with when the long profile is cut. OpenRoads places it wherever it likes. It doesn't place it back at 00 or wherever. So to minimize the pain, ended up creating separate profile files or long cut files, separate OPMP files that one profile per file. And then you're also not updating those profiles every time you open the file because it reprocesses all of the civil annotations that maybe the drafter had gone in and edited and made it cleared the conflicts, etc. And so separate files for each profile, driveways, walls, curb returns. If you have a profile, any sort of profile really should have, in my opinion, is to create a separate profile, because then I know it's done and it can be left alone. For drainage notes, I projected my drainage flow lines into the dynamic profile of the geometry file and then annotated them in the profile long cuts. using the civil labeler. This worked really well because it is a drawing type model for that civil labeler.
And Elisa, did you already explain that you did not use drainage and utilities to create your networks? They were actually linear geometry.
You're right. I did not use the drainage and utility tools. I created regular corridors for my pipes that I could then project into my profile. At the time, the drainage and utilities didn't function the way I needed it to for an existing system. So that's why I chose to go the route I did. I know our drainage and utility configuration is being updated, so I'm hoping in the future that will be through drainage and utilities.
Right. But this was a great workaround that you did. You just projected those linear features from the drainage flow lines into your geometry profile. Gotcha.
Correct. And then I could tag them in the profile for station and offsets or stations and elevations for the annotation needed in the profile view of drainage callouts. And that would go in this long time. Yeah.
That was annotations. When you say tag, you're actually placing like civil annotations in the drawing type model that's displaying the geometry profile plus the drainage flow line.
Correct.
Yeah. Cool.
Okay. So the profile is kind of a side file, but it is necessary for a project and for plans. So okay, the next couple files to discuss is the terrain and cross sections, which you don't really think about until the end. My advice would be to think about them before the end. I got caught a few times on my terrains and the cross sections on how I was actually going to cut them. You know, which alignment, where was I starting and stopping these terrains or alignment or cross sections. And so if I had known that info at the beginning and I could kind of map out how my terrains were going to look, that would have been super helpful. So just keep that in mind. Even my suggestion would be to cut a terrain and cut a cross section early on in the project just to see what is happening so that you can adjust appropriately. Trying to split the files later is a lot harder, a lot more maintenance or updating of, in your terrains, you'll find your templates aren't up to snuff or aren't showing the correct components or feature lines. And so pay attention to that early and it'll ease some pain you might have later. And in this project, I chose to, the terrains are cut just a little differently than the corridors. I actually combined and made left, as you see here, the green left sidewalk and right sidewalk corridors all in one file. And then the main backbone was a separate terrain because I have to produce in this project had subgrade AMG grinding surfaces that needed to go out. So the sidewalks weren't needed in those, and it was easier to create a terrain of the sidewalks separately. When you transfer to the cross sections, all of those files get attached to the cross sections, so they actually line up and are seamless. So you don't have to break your cross sections up by your terrains. It becomes, you add your in conditions all together, and it does annotate them all based off the alignment you're cutting your cross section. So that was pretty nifty. The curb returns I also tied in to the side street alignments. I didn't cut separate cross sections or terrains for those. I bulked them into one terrain for the side streets. And this data is for the handout. The terrain is where you'll head with the XML files that you need to create. So this was an easier way of handling the XMLs. So the cross sections are slightly different. I don't have a cross section layout, but they're cut off the main line and they do show the whole sidewalk and backbone.
I imagine you probably had separate cross sections for like that magenta alignment on the left and the funny green yellow one on the right.
Yes, that is true.
Okay, your major secondary alignments, you'd have a separate cross section.
Correct, yeah. Separate cross section. Yeah, I still ended up on this project having 11 different cross section files. Due to each one of these little guys gets a cross section file. So
inquiring minds want to know what method did you find particularly useful in creating the terrains?
I use the pick by element.
Gives you the most control, doesn't it?
Yeah, gave me the most control. It did. And so I would go in and display the 3D feature lines. I would figure out which ones were not being displayed correctly and fix them, because that happens. You know, the feature definition in the points were off, or as you've talked about in previous Wednesday sessions, the making sure it comes in first in a real, it's not a null point. I had those issues.
Not a null point, yeah. That makes it not triangulatable, yeah.
That's right. And so then I would just rotate the 3D view in the terrain and just pick each one individually and create the terrain off of that, because then I could control exactly what was displayed. That's a good question.
Yeah, got a thumbs up. Oh, there's a question. Alexander, do you want to unmute and ask your question?
I was just wondering how you did like that magenta bottom left there, where we have, you know, more than like that radius with a curve where you're gonna have potentially 2 or 3 points. How did you manage going through that, where if you cut a cross section there, you're gonna see back a curve a couple times or back a walk?
So the cross sections. Yes, you're right. Cross sections shouldn't control on a curb return here, because your ADA curb return detail controls with station and elevation, correct? And so when I cut the cross sections, I didn't have the sidewalk modeled. I just had the edge of pavement at that time. And when you cut cross sections, it only shows the edge of pavement, right? So I basically said I don't want to display everything else in the cross section. So with cross sections, the display is based off of the corridors, really, right? So you add all your corridors in, right? You just detach that corridor you don't want annotated. It can visually be seen, and then it annotates what you want it to do. And there's a width, right? There's some manipulation you have to do. You're going to look at them, right? You're going to check them out. But working with my construction office, they didn't care about those because the ADA details controlled. So they're like, yeah, just cut them out there. It is what it is. And I went, okay. So I think there's a little bit of that. We used to cut in inroads. Yeah, I used to cut cross sections on every curb return, right? We'd have curb return 1, but that's not helpful to them, at least in region 2. The construction folks said, no, we don't use those. So put them in with the main or the side street. And I went, okay. And in the main corridor too, those terrains are on. So you'll see those as it comes through the main corridor, right? As the cross sections come through here, it'll pick up this way as well. So the data is there. It just might take a couple files to get to it. If anybody has a better way, I am open to that. This was just the first round of how do we do it.
There are multiple ways.
Yeah, absolutely.
But you know, we're all curious as to what worked well for you. Yeah. So, and then Chris, Boris, you got your hand up. Question, comment?
I guess want to reiterate something that Elisa mentioned, and that is, you know, as far as when you're cutting the cross sections, it's the corridor and the corridor annotation that are giving you the kind of those labels. And so if you want to see, you could display your terrain to give you that top finish grade surface for everything, you know, so you could have that turned on your terrain file, but you could selectively only display the corridors that you want to annotate in your cross sections. So there's I don't know, I just wanted to reiterate that point.
No, that's great. Thanks, Chris. That's exactly what I was trying to say. So I appreciate that. That helps. With the cross sections too, having separate files for each cross section set you cut to helps you not have to try to replace them. You can cut a cross section, you can see if it looks right, scrap the file, recut a new one, and get the right corridors or terrains attached. So trying to put them all in one file would not be helpful in that way, because trying to delete those sheet models would be cumbersome. So, okay. The next, this is kind of the end of the file scenario. I do have some considerations, and then if there were other questions on other files, the main one is what do you want to rebuild if the file gets lost? So mine was a 3 to 5 day. Like, you could do 1 curb ramp or 2 curb ramps in 5 days if you had to rebuild it, or 1 block of sidewalk, basically. So that's how, when I get an urban job now, that's how I look at it. I break them up into those. The complexity of the corridor model. How many template drops you're going to have, how many point controls you're going to have, how many parametric constraints you're going to have. If you start to get into high numbers, you might want to consider breaking it apart. Do a backbone with end conditions, because it'll decrease the amount of processing time the program needs. Whether it's urban or rural, some rural jobs might be complex. You might have some super elevation adjustments and need to separate it out, or it might be super simple and you throw 2 lanes down a rural road and away you go. So that's consideration. Number of intersections and the number of ramps in the intersections goes back to, you can put all your eggs in one basket. That I will not do that. That's not my opinion. Keep it smaller. It's not easy to break apart files later either. So if you've designed it all out and then just want to say, hey, I'm going to copy and paste or copy the file, it starts getting hard because things are ruled to other things, and you could lose more than what you've originally thought, because you delete 1 line that you then ruled to a corridor in another file and have to figure it out. So it's easier to start small. And then in Lenny's lovely sayings, files are cheap, but your sanity is not. So more files could potentially ease your pain. So, and then that's kind of what I had for this. If something wasn't clear or need more explanation,
Thank you, Elisa.
Yeah.
I really appreciate you sharing your experience. And I posted in the chat some other considerations. I think there was 3 others that you mentioned that weren't on your slide.
Oop.
And then Chris has pointed out that you've used the project-wise file name CIVL for some of your geometry, and that's an option. Chris
Not
says
sure.
this file type is a good choice for creating your ORD-based intelligent layout as opposed to an alignment geometry file. It's something that Chris has used, the civil file as opposed to the geometry file. But all alignments are linear geometry. Geometry is kind of the parent category. So, but they're both there, civil and geometry. And Chris was also saying that smaller designs that are small don't need to be broken out into separate file types. Another saying that I have is begin as you mean to go along, and don't forget about scope creep. And I know they keep saying, oh yeah, we've gotten rid of scope creep, but it's easier to aggregate files, bring them together through referencing. It's easier to do that than it is to try to break them apart when you have processing that takes too long. So I kind of side with what Elisa was showing you here with the files of different types and different files. But they don't have to be. If you truly have a small project, like Chris says, you could use the civil file to store everything in there. Don't call me when it blows up. Does anybody else have any questions or comments for Elisa? Just unmute yourself. Have a go.
Mhm.
Elisa, thank you so much for putting this
You're welcome.
together. That was interesting for me. Appreciate it.
You're welcome.
Okay, folks, I'm going to stop the recording, and you may leave. Oh, I do see a hand raised. Go ahead.